and welcome to another episode of Sonic Touch. It's, this must be 17. Sweet 17.
Yes.
Or something. Anyway, lots been happening since our last episode. Sorry about the delays. Obviously, we've launched a new site design. That's been taking up quite a lot of time. But there have been some other aspects. Anyway, but first, I'm Nick Batt, editor of SonicState.com, and
I'm Gaz Williams.
So to begin with, we've had some new hardware out. I mean, this is kind of one of the major issues, and it hasn't really kind of slipped under the radar somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, we knew, or, rumours were pointing to the launch of the iPad Mini.
Which is an interesting aspect, obviously smaller format, easier in the hand, perhaps.
But the fourth generation of the iPad sort of slipped out at the same time as well, which I think in many ways is more interesting for musicians.
Yeah, because basically with the iPad 4, I mean, I know that's not what you're supposed to call it, but that's what I'm going to call it. The iPad 4 has a much faster processor.
Significantly faster, actually. There's been some benchmarks posted on the internet recently which show the processor speeds, and it shows a comparison between the iPad 2, the iPad 3 and the iPad 4.
I'll switch to it here. In fact, this is on ZNet. It says 1.4 gigahertz processor, and if we scroll down, there's a few facts and figures between it's got a Geekbench bench of 1757, and if we get, this is the graphic that kind of really is telltale. Yes. I mean, that is basically fourth generation is, well, significantly faster than the iPad 2 by a massive amount there. I mean, it's a huge leap.
Because we noticed when the third generation came out that there didn't seem to be that much difference, and we can see there that there's only a marginal increase. But then you look at the jump between the third generation and the fourth generation, and, it's nearly...
iPhone 5 there having a pretty good leap in processor as well.
Absolutely, yeah. This has a lot to do with the A6X processor. There's a different architecture there that allows for sort of significantly faster processor speeds, which I think is very useful for musicians, especially given that Audio Bus will be out soon and we'll be really, really needing as much horsepower as possible.
Yeah, I mean, Audio Bus, obviously, if you've not been paying attention or have heard about it, it's the new inter-app audio real-time processing protocol, which is really, really quite powerful.
Yes, and it's near to being released now. We've actually seen demos of it in use, so we can understand how it's much more usable now than before.
So, and an addendum to that, there were a couple of apps that I wanted to review this week that I wanted to run on the iPad 1, and they're just not happening. I mean, the iPad 1 is pretty much well and truly orphaned. I mean, if you think iOS 5 is the furthest we can go, I can't get up to 6. And obviously, the new developers want to take advantage of the applications that of the features that iOS 6 and above and the new processors. And now iPad 1 is kind of pretty much history.
Yes, and I mean, in terms of making a product going obsolete, when was the iPad? In 2.5 years ago or thereabouts.
Yeah, it's pretty terrifying, isn't it? But on the plus side, there's also news that Windows 8 has kind of entered the fray. I recently shot an interview with Jordan Rudess of Wisdom Music, who's been making some applications for Windows 8 and Windows Surface, which is Windows 8 RT, and that sounds quite promising. And not only that, but Microsoft seem to be encouraging this kind of music application ecosystem. So maybe we'll see some competition, right?
Oh, let's hope so. I mean, I think Apple now have been too long at the top, so let's hope that the competition's going to bring better products out for everybody else.
Yep. And now we're going to take a look at a couple of apps in the granular synthesis world, right, Gaz?
Yes, we've seen granular synthesis in a few apps before now, most notably in one of my favourites, Grain Science. But there's a couple of apps which have come out recently, both released at the same time by an Italian developer.
Before you launch there, actually one thing, granular synthesis, just for those who perhaps don't know, is different to standard synthesis in that it takes an audio wave file and it sort of takes very small slices of it and moves and shifts around, speeds up and slows down, so you get this really ethereal, otherworldly, unusual kind of slices of sound. Would that be a good way of describing it?
I think it's a great description. I mean, it is, I think, the uses of granular is maybe more within atmospheric
and experimental music. But it's becoming more mainstream with applications like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's have a look. iDensity from Apesoft. So here we can see we've got the waveform along the bottom. Now we can bring in that waveform either from an existing app through the audio copy paste functionality, or we could just hit the microphone and just sample directly in, just like a sampler. But what I think is quite interesting about this is that it enables us to sort of actually to interact with the waveform itself. Now,
what is that waveform?
Yeah, this waveform is a guitar part that I've played. So let's just bring that in, and if I just push play, and we can just hear it's just playing through the waveform like so, and I could just move or jump around the waveform. Now, pretty much the granularity is bypassed here. Now, if I jump to another snapshot, we can start to hear things. I really like how I can just move to different chords, and if I let go, the time scanning that sets. I mean, at the moment it's working in reverse.
So that orange thing is the kind of the
playhead.
What it's actually the playhead.
Yeah.
Right.
So we can see here at the end, you can hear how it's coming in slow, but within that little orange band, that's the area in which the granularity is going on. Like, so if I just hold it there and stop it moving, I can change the granular length here. We can see it getting narrower until it's like you can just hear that. But it's more musical as you open it up. Now, the grain density is how many of these grains go, so it sounds richer as we increase it. Let's drop the pitch down here.
Ooh, is there a delay or something going on there?
Yeah, there's some effects here. I've just got a stereo echo on here. If I take that off, it makes things sound a bit cruder, so the delay actually smooths things quite a lot. We've also got some reverb, only a dry and wet amount, but there's some filters and a ring mod. But one of the things that's quite cool though is I can make snapshots by hitting the camera icon, and then by adding a plus there, and then we can go to this grid here.
Ooh.
And this enables me to just like to move between different snapshots and morph between them. That can go full screen as well. Now, so you can hear how this is much more into the realm of sound design than sort of musicality. But where I thought it was quite useful was if we just jump back now to if I played all chords of a song that I was working on, sampled the chords, and then it becomes like an instrument. Then you can move to the different chords. And we've not really seen that before.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
It's got potential there to create quite an interesting instrument. I mean, it does sound very etheric. Ethereal, I think is the word I was looking for.
Etheric.
But it's got a simplicity. I find myself sort of drifting. It's very drifty and wafty, which is not a bad thing.
No, but I mean, I think granularity. I think it is a little bit of an odd thing to find applications for. But Apesoft have released 2 apps simultaneously. This, as I say, is iDensity, but they've also done iPulsaret, which the difference here is rather than having the waveform, you've got it's actually more about making a synthesizer with a keyboard, and
so you can play it more traditional.
You play it more traditionally. I would say, though, in terms of a synthesizer, it's got some way to go to match the wonderful grain science, which still, as a granular synthesizer, that one is the one that's
the daddy.
It's the daddy. But I particularly liked, as I say, the iDensity, especially being able to see the waveform and to be able to interact with the waveform. I think is an excellent.
So, is there any kind of MIDI possibility with it as well?
Yes, very, very basic MIDI in.
Hold that. We've got the nano key plugged in.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's good, and that's a recent update. If you haven't got MIDI in your version of this, then it's 1.03, right?
Yes, that's right, yeah. So yeah, I think as a synthesizer, it's interesting, and you can get some interesting sounds out of it. But I think for me, I prefer the iDensity, where you're actually interacting with the waveform, because I think that's that uses the multi-touch in quite an interesting way, being able to...
It's kind of a unique interfacing with granular synthesis. Quite interesting.
Yes, yes.
Both apps are by a company called Apesoft, and they're available at $8.99, which I'm guessing is what, around...
I think it's £5.50, I think, or
something
around
like that.
Yeah.
Okay. But now we've got a late addition to the show, and it's something that Gaz became aware of through a tweet via Richard Devine. Is that right?
Yeah, the first thing this morning, so it's hot off the press.
Ah, right. So what are we talking about here?
Okay, this is an app called Gestrument, which is...
Gestrument.
Gestrument.
Sounds a bit like Gestrument. That's a tricky word to say without getting it wrong, isn't it?
But obviously fusing the words gesture and instrument together, and I think it is one of the most interesting ones I've seen in recent times. So let's have a look. Okay, so loading up Gestrument. Okay, so what Gestrument is it's a little bit like it's like a touch instrument, but when I add. You can have multiple voices playing simultaneously, and each voice can move up and down through scales and at different time.
Put your finger on it, let's have a listen.
Yeah. So here, each of the coloured rectangles is a voice. This is just using the internal GM synth, but these all could be,
So you can provide your own scale for each one.
Yeah.
And what about on the y-axis?
Okay, so the y-axis, along the top here, we can see different note values. So as I move up, then it'll only change, it's locked into the tempo, which is at 100 BPM. So anything on this y-axis here is changing sort of as a minim. Now here, it's like crotchets.
Let's go right at the other end. Ah, so it's sort of like a deconstructed arpeggiator?
Yes, in some ways, that's a good way of looking at it. And what you can do is, it kind of crosses between the thing of being a real-time instrument, but also a generative music app as well.
Right.
We've seen generative music apps from the likes of Brian Eno with Bloom, and most recently Scape, but also Mixticle and various other things. But this one gives you maybe a little bit more of an instrument at the same time. But
are there any other examples? Because it's quite hard to hear what's going on with
okay,
that.
well, if we were just to go through the tutorials very quickly, here's just a single voice. So as I'm moving through
nice.
it,
and can you play, if you put more than one finger on it, what happens?
right, the other finger, as I put one finger on, this controls the velocity.
Ah. So it's sort of double touch, you don't get multi-touch.
No, because really the thing about this is once you start to add extra voices, you then decide, if we go into the menu here, we can decide, okay, at the moment we can see we've just got a single instrument, which is coming from this GM sound bank, it's a flute. Now, if I was to enable a second instrument, and it's a clarinet here, now we can set what its pitch range it works in and what its time durations it works in. Now, jumping back, we've now got two voices. We can see them lit up at the bottom here, and we can just turn instruments on and off, like so. So we've got the flute, and they're both working at the same time scale now, but see here, they start to split.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, it's slightly random.
It kind of is. I mean, look, if we go back to this mode here, I suppose a lot of it is to do with how you can configure this. You can configure the scale. Well, in fact, there's two scales. We'll look at that in a moment. But you choose which notes that you want in. So say, for instance, we were working in a particular key, we could just choose certain notes here. Then, so now, by moving up and down, we're just moving up with the notes that we've designated. Now, we can then say, by putting pitch fluctuations, we can turn those on, and what that will mean is that the notes will sort of jump around randomly, but within the scale. Now,
so like with intervals and octaves?
Yes. Now, if I add pulse density, this will start to make notes repeat. So even if I just hold my finger now, and we can see, just holding my finger, the notes are now moving around. And then I can put rhythm randomness in as well. Let's go to a higher let's go up here. So this starts to become where it's more like a kind of a generative tool. Okay, and I was mentioning earlier as well, you've got a thing called scale morph. Now this is so you can have two separate scales and we can morph between the two scales.
I mean, that's quite a modern morpher, but I guess you could do it almost like 12-bar intervals, couldn't you? So you could almost make it bluesy.
Yeah, you could do, yeah. And for these sliders, we can see that there's a little button that can be selected at the side. Now, for instance, in scale, and what happens is here now, we've got an angle control here as well. So I can actually control the scale morph or whatever I choose, or the pitch fluctuations. For instance, if I select that.
Okay. It's quite interesting. I mean, it's not immediately obvious. Can you hook it up with external MIDI gear and stuff? Because that might be, I mean, you could program sort of beats and stuff on certain keys, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, basically, look, if we go into the editor here, then we can see, you know, that each instrument has got its own MIDI send. So you can imagine it could be sending out 8 different MIDI channels. Now that could be over the MIDI network, so that could be going to your software on your computer with a really high quality orchestral samples. This is just using a fairly cheesy internal GM sound bank, but if you're using very high quality samples, then you could imagine that this would be quite nice for making almost instantaneous classical music. You know,
does it output any other controller data for sort of more levels of control?
No, I think it's just. I think it will just output note data. So I think, yes, this is very much about the notes.
And I notice in the bottom there we've got MIDI clock and what's this? MIDI panic, so we've got...
Yes, so again, for when we're using it with MIDI, we can have a look. Synth settings here. This is just basically typical GM stuff, a little bit of reverb.
And quality and CPU
usage. CPU usage, yes. But yes, this isn't very much. This isn't like a synthesizer as such, which gives you very much control.
It's sort of mostly in there just so that you can demonstrate how.
Yes.
I mean, they don't sound all that bad though. The GM sounds, though, to be honest.
No, they sound nice, and they're certainly good enough for you to sort of start to learn how to use this unusual approach to playing notes. Now, I've not seen anything quite like it before, so I got quite excited about it. I haven't tried it with MIDI yet, but that's what I'm going to do once I get home. So this app is made by Jesper Nordin, and it's developed by Kymatica, and I paid £5.50, which I think is $8.99 or thereabouts. Although I do...
And available now, like today?
Available now, yes.
It's certainly an interesting application, one that's probably worth trying out just for... in terms of arpeggiation, it just sounds quite interesting.
Yes, and again, I think this is the sort of app where, you can get an instant result from, but I think once you were to start to actually set the scales and set the various parameters on it to within the context of what you're working, I think that's where it would start to be great. I can imagine it being a wonderful tool for overdubbing onto something. Because it's going to be very musical results.
Right, as long as you've got it set to the scale.
Exactly, yeah.
So that's it for another week. I want to say thank you very much for watching, and please do leave comments below.
Yeah, I mean, it's really helpful for us to kind of find things that we've overlooked or to get extra information.
Yeah, and any apps that you want us to take a look at, we'll certainly do our best. We can't spot them all, and so your input is very much welcome. So that's pretty much it for this week. Thank you very much for watching. That was Sonic Touch number 17.
17.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.